Hello from the Travel Tracker. Today's tip is for trip approvers who also have the responsibility of selecting a funding source and perhaps a budget code that will be responsible for paying for the trip request. From your Trip Approval tab, you will access your trip requests by clicking anywhere on the trip information to open the trip request. As you review the information on the request, you will scroll down to the area on the trip request form for the funding source, and the funding source will give you a drop down that you will use and select the funding source that is responsible for this particular trip. When you click on the drop down, you will see a list of funding sources that are available for this particular trip type for the particular school or requesting location. And you can review those and decide which particular funding source is responsible for this type of trip. When you click on that funding source, if there is an account code or a budget code that's been associated with that funding source in the funding source table setup, that budget code will populate as you see here in this example. Some funding sources have a funding approver that needs to approve that funding source to be used, and if it does, that funding approver will then be added into the flow of approvers. Some funding sources require you to either select or key in an account code. So for example, some of them funding sources may be an account code that you will select which account code applies, and you will then click on the budget code field and use that drop down and select the appropriate account code or budget code that's going to pay for this particular trip. And then other funding sources, of course, may just allow you to type in a budget code because you know what the budget code is perhaps. And you would just simply key that in. So that would be your options when you are choosing a funding source and or an account code. Of course, some districts may not require the budget code or the account code, and you won't be required to put that in. Notice also that some districts may have the option of choosing two funding sources to share the cost of a trip, and so if that is your district, then you would use the same process or procedure for selecting that that other account code or that other funding source on that second funding source. And if that is not a requirement in your district, then you may not see that option to have two. Once you have selected your funding source and perhaps added in a budget code, then you'll just simply scroll to the bottom of the request as you're reviewing the information until you get to your approval level, and then just like any other trip that you're approving, you can add comments, and then you'll indicate your approval for this particular trip with that funding source that's been added. And then of course this request will be routed to the next approver. Be sure you click the Save and Close at the bottom of the form to send this request on its way. So I hope this has been a helpful tip if you are a funding or a trip approver that needs to provide a funding source and perhaps a budget code. Thank you.